Smoke hung thick enough to chew in the cellar of the White Boar, Nku for 50 guineas. A ruined estate. Then a daughter. When the final king flipped, Beatrice didn't gasp or faint. She merely felt the draft against her ankles and realized she was no longer a woman. She was currency. The cellar smelled of sour ale, wet wool, and the unmistakable metallic tang of desperation. It was a suffocating basement beneath a crumbling London tavern, lit by tallow candles that spat grease onto the scarred wooden tables. Beatrice stood rigidly by the door, her back pressed against peeling wallpaper that felt damp through her thin muslin gown. She had been standing there for 4 hours. Her father, Arthur, had insisted she come. Just to stand by me, B. For luck. You're my good luck. She knew better. She was not luck. She was collateral. Arthur had paraded her past the drunken lords and the sharp-eyed creditors like a prize mare at a country fair. He had made sure they saw her pale, straight posture, the heavy mass of dark hair pinned at her nape, the youth she still possessed despite the hollows forming under her cheekbones. At the center table, Arthur's face was slick with a greasy sheen of sweat. His cravat hung loose, resembling a soiled bandage around his neck. His hands trembled as he gathered his remaining cards. Beatrice watched the dirt beneath his fingernails. She had spent her entire 19 years watching those hands gamble away her mother's jewelry, the silver spoons, the horses, and finally the roof over their heads. Across from him sat Thomas Linfield, the Duke of Canderley. Linfield did not belong in the White Boar. He wore no rings. His coat was tailored from a dark, heavy broadcloth, lacking the ostentatious embroidery favored by the other aristocrats in the room. He sat perfectly still. He didn't sweat. He didn't drink. He simply watched Arthur with a steady, ruinous patience. Linfield's face was hard planes and shadowed hollows, marred slightly by a faded, jagged scar that ran from his jawline to his collar, a souvenir, the whispers said, from a brutal cavalry skirmish in the peninsula. "You are out of chips, Holloway," Linfield said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of malice but heavy with finality. It cut through the clinking of glasses and the low murmurs of the room. Arthur licked his cracked lips. "I have credit. Your name is worth less than the mud on my boots," Linfield interrupted quietly. He placed his cards face down on the sticky felt. "You owe me £4,000. You have nothing left to wager. Fold. Go home." "No!" Arthur's voice cracked. He looked around the room wildly, his eyes finally snagging on Beatrice. A sickening jolt punched through her stomach. She recognized that look. It was the same look he had given her mother's piano before the bailiffs carried it away. "I have her," Arthur breathed, pointing a trembling finger toward the shadows. The room went dead silent. Even the barmaid stopped wiping the counter. Linfield slowly turned his head. His gaze found Beatrice in the dim light. She didn't shrink back. She met his eyes, forcing her chin up. Though her fingernails were biting so deeply into her palms, she felt the skin break. Linfield's eyes were a startling, cold gray. They swept over her, not with the leering hunger of the other men in the room, but with a sharp, calculating assessment that somehow felt worse. He was pricing her. "A human being is not a steak, Holloway," Linfield said, turning back to the table. "Are you entirely mad?" "She is untouched, well-bred, obedient," Arthur stammered, the words spilling out in a panicked rush. He grabbed a scrap of parchment from the center of the table and a discarded quill. He scratched frantically. "A special license can be bought by morning. I'll sign over my parental rights, her hand, everything. If I win this hand, the debt is cleared. If I lose, she is yours, to marry, to keep, to do with as you please." Beatrice couldn't breathe. The corset she wore suddenly felt like iron bands around her ribs. "Say no," she prayed, staring at the back of Linfield's dark head. "Throw him out, please." Linfield stared at the scrawled note. The silence stretched tight as a violin string. Beatrice could hear the shallow, wheezing breath of the man standing next to her. She could smell the cheap gin, then Linfield reached out and pulled the parchment toward him. "Fine," Linfield said softly. "Deal the cards." Beatrice's vision blurred at the edges. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. A cold, heavy numbness poured over her, freezing her blood. She watched the dealer's hands move in a blur. She heard the snap of the cards hitting the table. Arthur let out a ragged, triumphant laugh as he flipped his cards. "A straight, a cursed straight, Linfield. I told you." The luck turned. Linfield didn't blink. He reached out with a large, scarred hand and calmly turned his cards over one by one. 3 kings and a pair of 8s. A full house. Arthur's laugh died in his throat. He stared at the cards, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He swayed in his chair, suddenly looking very old and very small. Linfield stood up. The wooden chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. He picked up the piece of parchment with Arthur's signature on it, folded it once, and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. He didn't look at Arthur again. He walked across the room, his boots heavy on the floorboards, until he stopped 2 feet away from Beatrice. Up close, he smelled of rain, leather, and dark tobacco. He towered over her, his broad shoulders blocking out the dim light of the tavern. "Get your cloak," he said. Beatrice didn't look at her father as she walked out. She heard Arthur whimpering her name, a pathetic, wet sound that made her stomach turn. But she kept her eyes fixed firmly on the brass buttons of Linfield's greatcoat as she followed him up the narrow cellar stairs. The London air hit her face like a wet rag. It was raining, a fine, miserable mist that coated the cobblestones in a slick sheen. A black carriage with no crest on the door waited at the curb. The horses stamped their hooves, their breath pluming in the chill air. Linfield opened the carriage door himself. He didn't offer his hand to help her up. It was a small mercy. She wasn't sure she could bear the physical contact without flinching. She climbed in, the heavy velvet skirts of her gown tangling around her ankles, and pushed herself into the furthest corner of the leather bench. He climbed in after her, the carriage dipping under his weight, and shut the door. The interior was pitch black, smelling of polished wood and damp wool. The driver cracked the whip, and they lurched forward. For a long time, the only sound was the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the rattle of the carriage wheels over uneven stone. Beatrice sat frozen. Her feet, clad in thin slippers, were numb with cold. She huddled into her cheap wool cloak, shivering violently. It wasn't just the cold, it was the adrenaline draining from her system, leaving behind a terrifying, hollow void. She was riding in a carriage with a stranger who now owned her. She tried to picture what would happen when they arrived at his home. Would he drag her up the stairs? Would he demand a kiss, a touch, immediate submission? She had heard rumors of the Duke of Canderley. They called him the Iron Duke's Shadow, a man who had inherited a fortune but preferred the grim company of ledgers and silent rooms. A man who was ruthless in business and entirely absent from society. "You are shivering." His voice came from the darkness opposite her, startling her so badly she jolted against the wooden paneling. "I am fine," she lied. Her teeth clicked together as she spoke. A heavy, warm weight suddenly fell over her lap. He had taken off his greatcoat and tossed it across the carriage. It settled over her knees, thick, and smelled intensely of him. "Put it around your shoulders," he commanded. "I don't want it," she snapped, the first spark of real anger finally breaking through the ice in her veins. She pushed the heavy wool away. "I am not a pet you need to keep warm before you." She choked on the words, unable to finish the sentence. Linfield was silent for a moment. As the carriage passed beneath a street lamp, a sliver of yellow light dragged across his face. He looked exhausted. The deep lines around his mouth were tight, his brow furrowed. "Before I what, Miss Halloway?" he asked softly. "Before you take what you won," she whispered bitterly, looking out the window at the blurred passing buildings. "Do not pretend to be chivalrous. You sat at a table and accepted a human life as a wager. You are no better than he is." "I am acutely aware of what I am," Linfield replied, his tone frighteningly flat. "But you are incorrect about what I intend to take." "Then what do you want?" She turned her head, trying to pierce the gloom to see his eyes. Why did you take the bet? Because if I hadn't, your father would have wagered you to Lord Denholm in the next hand, or to that pox-ridden baronet sitting to his left. Linfield's voice grew harder, a low rasp of disgust. And they would not have bothered to bring you to a carriage. They would have taken you in the alley behind the boar. Beatrice felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She knew he was right. Denholm had been looking at her mouth all evening. So I am supposed to be grateful, she bit back, her voice shaking. You bought me to save me. How remarkably noble. Shall I write a ballad about your heroism, your grace? She expected him to shout. She expected a slap. Men in her father's circle did not tolerate being spoken to with such venom. Instead, Linfield sighed. It was a heavy, weary sound that seemed to deflate his massive frame. I do not want your gratitude. I do not want a ballad. I just want you to sit quietly until we reach my house. You are safe. You will not be touched. Let that be enough for the next 10 minutes. He turned his head away, staring out his own window into the rainy night. Beatrice pulled his coat over her shoulders. The warmth of it soaked through her damp dress, stopping her shivers. It felt like a heavy armor. She hated that it comforted her. She hated the situation, hated her father, and most of all, she hated the confusing, quiet man sitting across from her who held a crumpled piece of paper that dictated the rest of her life. They did not speak again until the carriage rolled to a halt. The Canderley townhouse was in Mayfair, but it lacked the luminous, inviting glow of its neighbors. It stood tall and imposing, a severe facade of dark brick, with only 2 windows illuminated on the ground floor. Linfield stepped out first, pausing in the rain. He looked back at her, standing in the doorway of the carriage, swallowed by his oversized coat. He extended a hand. Beatrice stared at his palm. It was wide, the fingers thick and calloused. She ignored it, stepping down onto the wet pavement unassisted. Linfield simply dropped his hand, his expression unreadable, and led the way up the marble steps. The front door was opened by a butler who looked as austere as the house itself. He didn't blink at the sight of a drenched, shivering young woman following his master at 2 in the morning. Bates, Linfield said, shrugging off his wet jacket since Beatrice still wore his coat. Bring a tray of tea and cold meat to the study, and tell Mrs. Higgins to prepare the blue guest room. At once, Your Grace, Linfield gestured down the hall. This way. The inside of the house was not lavish. There were no gilded mirrors or towering floral arrangements. The floors were dark oak, partially covered by faded Persian rugs. It felt empty, a house meant for holding furniture rather than living. He opened heavy oak doors and ushered her into a massive study. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center, piled high with ledgers and maps. The only source of light and warmth was a large hearth, where the embers of a dying fire pulsed with a dull, orange glow. Sit, he told her, pointing to a wing-back chair near the fireplace. Beatrice moved rigidly, sinking into the leather chair. She kept the greatcoat wrapped tightly around herself, her hands gripping the armrests. She watched him like a trapped animal watches a predator. Linfield walked to a side table and poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He walked over and held it out to her. Drink it, he said. It will stop the shaking. I don't drink spirits. Tonight you do. She hesitated, then snatched the glass from his hand. Careful not to brush his fingers, she took a sip. The brandy burned a fiery trail down her throat, making her cough, but a sudden, welcome heat bloomed in her chest. Linfield turned away. He walked to the hearth and grabbed a heavy iron poker, jabbing viciously at the logs until a fresh flame leapt up, crackling and spitting green wood sap. He stood there for a long moment, staring into the fire, the orange light casting long, harsh shadows across his scarred face. Then he reached into his waistcoat pocket. He pulled out the folded piece of parchment. Arthur's note, the deed to her life. Beatrice stopped breathing. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. This was it. He was going to lay out his terms. He was going to explain exactly how she was to serve him to work off her father's debt. She braced herself, tightening her jaw, preparing to spit whatever defiance she could muster. Linfield didn't unfold the paper. He didn't even look at it. He simply opened his hand and dropped it into the roaring fire. Beatrice gasped, jerking forward in her chair. The parchment landed on a burning log. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the edges browned, curling inward like dying leaves. A bright yellow flame caught the corner, and in a matter of seconds, the paper blackened. The ink of her father's desperate signature warping and vanishing into ash. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice rough. Linfield turned to face her. The firelight caught the grim set of his mouth. "The debt is burned, Miss Halloway." She stared at the curled black cinder in the grate. It felt like a trick. It had to be a trick. "Why?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. "That was £4,000. That was your leverage. Why would you burn it?" "Because it offended me," Linfield said simply. "Stir." He walked slowly toward her. Beatrice shrank back, pressing herself into the deep upholstery of the chair. But he didn't reach for her. Instead, when he was a foot away, the Duke of Canderley did something she could never have anticipated. He went down on one knee. He didn't kneel with the dramatic, sweeping grace of a courtier proposing marriage. He dropped heavily, his knee hitting the floorboards with a dull thud, bringing his face level with hers. Up close, she could see the silver threads at his temples, the exhaustion bruised beneath his eyes. He looked up at her, completely stripping away his height, his title, his physical dominance in the room. "I apologize," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, and entirely sincere. "I apologize for the indignity of this evening. I apologize for the pathetic weakness of the man who sired you, and I apologize for sitting at that table and participating in a system that allowed you to be traded like a sack of grain." Beatrice's chest heaved. The brandy and the heat from the fire were suddenly suffocating. Her mind spun wildly, trying to find the angle, the manipulation. Men did not do this. Dukes did not kneel to the ruined daughters of bankrupt gamblers. "Stop," she croaked, gripping the edges of his coat. "Get up. Do not play games with me. Just tell me what you want." "I want nothing from you," Linfield replied steadily, not moving an inch. "The paper is gone. You are not mine. You never were. You are a free woman." "Free?" A harsh, ugly laugh tore from her throat. She couldn't stop it. The tears she had held back all night finally spilled over, hot and humiliating, tracking through the soot on her cheeks. "I am ruined. I was dragged through a gambling hell. I'm in a man's house unchaperoned. My father has nothing. I have nothing. I have no family, no money, and nowhere to go. You haven't freed me, Your Grace. You have just thrown me to the street without a marker." She brought her hands up to cover her face, trembling violently, expecting him to be angered by her outburst. She felt completely unraveled, a messy, broken thing in his pristine study. Linfield didn't flinch. He stayed on his knee. "You are not going to the street," he said quietly, waiting for her crying to subside. "You will stay in the guest room upstairs tonight. Tomorrow my solicitor will draw up papers, an independent income, in your name. Enough to live comfortably anywhere in England, a cottage in Bath, perhaps, or a townhouse in York, wherever you wish to go, away from Arthur Halloway." Beatrice slowly lowered her hands. Her eyes were red, her chest heaving. She stared at the man kneeling before her, searching his rugged face for a lie. "Why?" she whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of her, leaving her utterly exhausted. "Why are you doing this?" Linfield looked down at his own scarred hands, resting lightly on his thigh. "Because a long time ago, in a war you have only read about, I saw what happens when men treat human lives as commodities. I spent years trying to wash the blood and the guilt off my hands." He looked back up at her, his gray eyes piercingly sad. "When I looked at you at night, standing by that wall, waiting for the axe to fall, I saw a casualty of a war you never asked to fight. I have the money, Miss Halloway. It costs me nothing to be decent, and it costs you nothing to accept it." He stood up slowly, his knee joints popping slightly. He didn't offer a handkerchief or try to comfort her. He gave her space. "Bates will show you to your room. Lock the door if it makes you feel safe. I will not bother you." He walked toward the door of the study, leaving her sitting by the fire, entirely stripped of the cynicism she had worn as armor for years. "Your Grace," she called out, her voice shaky but clear. Linfield paused at the door, turning his head slightly. Beatrice looked at the black ash in the hearth, then at his broad back. The resentment and anger were melting, replaced by a terrifying, fragile thing she hadn't felt in years. "Hope." "Thank you," she whispered. Linfield gave a single, curt nod. "Good night, Beatrice." He closed the door behind him with a soft click, leaving her alone in the warmth. The mattress was too soft. It smelled aggressively of dried lavender and lye soap, a clean, sharp scent that made Beatrice feel filthy in her wrinkled muslin gown. She had not undressed. She had spent the night sitting on the edge of the mattress, the heavy brass key turned securely in the lock, waiting for the doorknob to twist. It never did. When the pale, watery London sunlight finally bled through the gaps in the heavy velvet curtains, the silence of the house felt heavier than the dark. Beatrice stood up, her joints popping in protest. Her mouth tasted like old copper and fear. She walked to the washstand, broke the thin crust of ice over the porcelain pitcher, and splashed the freezing water onto her face. The shock of the cold was a relief. It proved she was awake. It proved the fire, the burned parchment, and the kneeling Duke had not been a stress-induced hallucination. She did not touch the fresh, stiffly pressed day dress the maid had left folded on the armchair. Wearing his clothes felt like accepting a collar. She smoothed the wrinkles of her own damp dress as best she could, pinned her hair back with trembling fingers, and unlocked the door. The house in daylight was just as severe as it had been in the dark. No portraits lined the halls. No flowers softened the mahogany tables. It was a fortress of quiet utility. She found Linfield in the breakfast room, a space dominated by a long, scarred oak table. He sat at the far end, bathed in the gray morning light, a stack of shipping manifests spread out before him. He wore no cravat, his collar open, revealing the thick, white scarring that crawled down his neck. He looked up when she entered. He didn't smile, but he set his pen down. "Tea?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Coffee," Beatrice said. She needed the bitterness. She needed to stay alert. A silver pot sat on a warming stand. She poured it herself, ignoring the hovering footman, and took a seat 3 chairs away from Linfield. The coffee was scalding and thick. "Mr. Penhaligon will be here in 20 minutes, Linfield said, his eyes dropping back to his papers. "He is my solicitor. The documents are already drafted. You will only need to sign your name to establish the trust." Beatrice wrapped her hands around the hot porcelain cup. "And what does the trust require of me?" Linfield turned a page. "A pulse, nothing more." She stared at the sharp line of his jaw. "People do not give away £500 a year for nothing, Your Grace." "I am giving away 600, he corrected mildly, not looking up. "And I am not people. I am a man with more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, buying himself a clean conscience. Do not romanticize it, Miss Halloway. It is entirely selfish." It was a lie. She knew it was a lie, a shield he held up to deflect her scrutiny. But before she could press him, the heavy oak doors swung open. A small, meticulous man with spectacles and a leather portfolio bustled in. Mr. Penhaligon smelled of parchment, dust, and peppermints. He barely glanced at Beatrice, treating her presence at the Duke's breakfast table as a matter of routine business rather than a scandal. "Your Grace," Penhaligon murmured, unbuckling the portfolio. "The deeds are prepared. The funds have been transferred to the Coots account under Miss Halloway's name." He slid a thick stack of vellum across the polished wood toward Beatrice. He offered her a freshly dipped quill. "Sign by the red seals, if you please, miss." Beatrice stared at the black ink, dripping from the feathered tip. It looked like blood. She read the first page. It was dense with legal terminology, but the core was glaringly clear. Absolute autonomy, irrevocable trust, sole discretion of the beneficiary. Her hand hovered over the paper. This was the exit. This was the door swinging open to a life where she would never have to calculate the cost of a loaf of bread. Never have to hide her mother's silver in her petticoats. Never have to stand against a damp tavern wall while men bit on her flesh. It felt like a trap. It felt too easy. She pressed the quill to the paper. Then the crash came. It echoed from the front hall. The sound of shattering porcelain, followed immediately by a string of slurred, violent curses. Beatrice's hand jerked, leaving a thick, black smear across the vellum. The breath was punched out of her lungs. She knew that voice. She had heard it 1,000 times, cursing horses, cursing cards, cursing her mother's memory. "Get your hands off me, you stiff-necked bastard. Where is he, Canderley? Where is my daughter?" Linfield stood up. His chair scraped violently against the floorboards. The quiet, weary man vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by something cold, massive, and deeply dangerous. "Stay here," Linfield ordered, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. He bypassed the table, heading for the doors. But Beatrice was already moving. The paralyzing terror she expected didn't come. Instead, a hot, nauseating fury spiked in her chest. She had spent 19 years staying behind doors while Arthur Halloway ruined their lives. She was not going to hide in the Duke's breakfast room. She followed Linfield into the foyer. Arthur was struggling against 2 footmen. He looked worse in the daylight. His coat was torn at the shoulder, his face smeared with soot and vomit. He smelled of stale gin and unwashed desperation. When he saw Linfield, he stopped thrashing. When he saw Beatrice stepping out from behind the Duke's broad frame, his eyes lit up with a feverish, feral greed. "B!" Arthur spat, wrenching his arm free. "Get your cloak, we are leaving." "You are trespassing, Halloway," Linfield said. He didn't raise his voice, but the footman immediately stepped back, leaving Arthur standing alone in the center of the marble floor. "Remove yourself from my house before I have you thrown into the street." "Your house," Arthur sneered, swaying slightly on his feet. He pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger at Linfield. "You cheated me. I went to the magistrate this morning. I told him what happened. You burned the marker. You destroyed the proof of the wager." Arthur let out a wet, triumphant laugh. "No marker, no debt paid. And without a signed contract, the girl is still my legal ward. She is underage. You stole my property, Canderley." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. Her father was right. In the eyes of the law, an unmarried woman of 19 belonged to her father. The burned parchment wasn't just proof of the debt. It was the transfer of guardianship. By destroying it to save her dignity, Linfield had inadvertently handed Arthur his leash back. "She is not your property," Linfield said quietly. "The law says otherwise," Arthur countered, a sickening smirk twisting his cracked lips. He took a step toward Beatrice. "Come here, Bay. Lord Denholm is waiting. He's willing to overlook last night's little adventure if we come to terms this morning." He offered 3,000. Beatrice's stomach heaved. Denholm. The man who had stared at her mouth. Arthur had gone straight from the White Boar to sell her again. Linfield stepped smoothly into Arthur's path, blocking Beatrice entirely. "If you take one more step toward her," Linfield said, his tone perfectly conversational, "I will break both of your legs, and then I will buy up every promissory note you have in London, and there are dozens, Halloway, and I will personally ensure you rot in the Fleet Prison until your bones turn to dust." Arthur stopped. The cowardice in him flared, warring with the greed. He swallowed hard, looking at the sheer size of the Duke. "You can't keep her," he whined, his bravado fracturing. "It's kidnapping, it's theft." "It is neither." Beatrice pushed past Linfield. "Beatrice, no," Linfield warned, reaching for her arm, but she shook him off. She stepped up to her father. She didn't look at the dirt on his face or the pathetic slump of his shoulders. She looked directly into his watery, bloodshot eyes. For the first time in her life, she didn't see a monster. She just saw a weak, rotting man. "I am not going with you," Beatrice said. Her voice didn't shake. It was shockingly steady, ringing clear off the marble walls. "Don't be a fool, girl," Arthur hissed, trying to grab her wrist. Beatrice didn't flinch away. She slapped his hand down. The crack of her palm against his skin echoed sharply in the foyer. Arthur stumbled back, clutching his hand, his mouth open in shock. "You lost me," Beatrice said, the words heavy and final. "You put me on a table and you gambled me away. You don't get to claim the law now. You don't get to claim being my father. You are nothing to me. If you ever come near me again, I will not wait for the Duke to send you to the fleet. I will slit your throat while you sleep in whatever gutter you pass out in. Do you understand me?" Arthur stared at her. He looked terrified. He wasn't looking at his obedient, silent daughter anymore. He was looking at a stranger forged in the fire he had started. He took a step back, then another. He looked at Linfield, who was watching Beatrice with an expression of stunned, quiet reverence. And then he turned. Arthur shoved the heavy front doors open and stumbled out into the street, vanishing into the London fog. The adrenaline crashed through Beatrice like a collapsing building. Her knees buckled. Linfield was there instantly. His large hands caught her by the elbows, steadying her. His grip was firm, grounding, but he didn't pull her into him. He held her upright until she caught her breath, then slowly let go. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. Beatrice looked at the open doorway, the cold air rushing in. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I am." They walked back into the breakfast room in silence. Mr. Penhaligon was standing by the window, intensely pretending to examine the drapery. Beatrice walked back to the table. She picked up the quill. Her hand was completely steady now. She dipped it in the ink and signed her name with aggressive, sharp strokes across the bottom of the vellum. She pushed the papers back to Penhaligon. "Make sure the ink is dry before you file it," she told him. The solicitor nodded quickly, packing his portfolio with frantic efficiency before bowing himself out of the room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving Beatrice and Linfield entirely alone in the quiet house. Linfield walked over to the sideboard and poured a glass of water, setting it down near her hand. "Bath is very quiet this time of year," he said softly, leaning against the edge of the table. "Wait, you will like it. The air is better than London. I can have a carriage prepared for you by noon." Beatrice looked at the glass of water. Then she looked up at Linfield. "Mum?" He was staring out the window, his profile harsh in the morning light, the scar pulling tight across his cheek. He looked immensely tired. He looked like a man who spent his life clearing away ledgers and debts, preferring numbers because they didn't bleed. He had bought her freedom. But freedom was a terrifying, empty landscape. Bath was a town full of strangers. She would be a woman alone, living on the charity of a man she barely knew. Safe, yes, but utterly isolated. She looked at his scarred hands resting on the polished oak. She thought about the way he had knelt in the ashes. She thought about the way he had stood between her and her father, but hadn't stopped her from fighting her own battle. "I don't want to go to Bath," Beatrice said. Linfield turned his head. His gray eyes were cautious. "York, then, or the coast. The trust allows you to live wherever you choose." "I choose here," Linfield frowned, pushing himself off the table. "London? Miss Halloway, your father is still in this city. Denholm is still in this city. It is not safe for you to remain." "I don't mean London," she interrupted. She stood up, her chair scraping softly against the floor. She walked around the table until she was standing a few feet away from him. She didn't look down. "I mean here, in this house." Linfield went completely still. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Beatrice," he said, and the way he said her name, like a warning, like a plea, sent a sudden, sharp heat straight to her chest. "Do not misunderstand what happened last night. I did not buy a mistress. I am not asking you to stay in my bed out of gratitude. I am not offering gratitude," she fired back, her chin lifting. "And I am not offering to be your mistress. I am 19, Your Grace. I have spent 5 years managing creditors, stretching pennies into pounds, and surviving a household built on lies. I know how to run an estate. I know how to spot a cheated ledger." She pointed to the stack of shipping manifests on the table. "You sit in this massive, empty house, drowning in paper, hiding from the world because you think your scars make you a monster. You need an estate manager who won't steal from you, and I need a place where I am useful, not just kept." Linfield stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and crackling with an entirely new kind of tension. He looked at her not as a victim, not as a casualty, but as an equal. He saw the sharp, cynical edge in her eyes, the steel she had forged in the dark. "You want employment," he said slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. "I want a partnership," Beatrice corrected. "I manage the house. I balance the ledgers. I earn my keep. The trust fund remains untouched in the bank. I will not be your charity case, Thomas." He sucked in a breath at the use of his Christian name. The weary, grim lines around his mouth slowly began to shift. It wasn't a smile. It was too fractured for that. But it was an awakening. The deep, gray coldness in his eyes sparked with a sudden, intense heat. He took a step toward her. The air between them suddenly felt very thin. Up close, she could smell the clean scent of soap and the dark trace of coffee on his breath. "It will be grueling," he warned, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated against her skin. I am demanding. I work impossible hours. I am not a gentleman." Beatrice looked at the jagged scar on his face, then up into his eyes. She didn't feel the urge to run. She felt a strange, fierce anchor drop in her chest. "I am not a gentlewoman," she replied. Linfield studied her face for a long, quiet moment. He reached up, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, his calloused thumb gently brushed a stray, dark curl away from her cheek. The touch was impossibly soft. "No," Linfield murmured, the ghost of a smile finally touching his lips. "I don't suppose you are." He let his hand drop, stepping back just enough to let her breathe. He gestured toward the chaotic stack of manifests on the table. "The Mediterranean shipping lines are a mess. We start there." Beatrice turned toward the table. The parchment was heavy. The ink was dark. But for the first time in her life, the numbers weren't counting down her ruin. They were building her foundation. She pulled a chair out, sat down, and reached for the pen. Wow, Beatrice didn't just survive, built her own empire right next to the Duke. If you love this intense, slow-burn romance where the heroine fights her own battles, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your fellow romance addicts so we can keep bringing you more deep, emotional stories. What was your favorite moment? Let me know in the comments below.